And now without further ado, let me go to my guest, Thomas Woods, who's probably, my favorite economist out there. He's a great speaker. He's got a great sense of humor. He understands Austrian economics. I'm going out to Ireland next week to speak at an economic festival that, Tom Woods really should be there because it's actually a combination of economists and stand-up comedians. And he's both. So they really should have invited him. But anyway, Tom, are you there?
I sure am, Peter. Congratulations on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
So can you believe what these guys are doing, what the Fed is doing, what Congress is doing, that they learned absolutely nothing from mistakes they made just a year or two ago?
Yeah, and I guess what is most frustrating about this is that there are so many Americans out there who went into November 2nd thinking, we're going to have a new start. It's going to be different this time. Everything's going to turn around. But I think the signal that things weren't going to turn around was when Wolf Blitzer asked Eric Cantor, can you just name me just give me one program you want to cut. Just give me one. Asked him this question twice. He couldn't give an answer. That's a bad sign. So that means you're going to continue with the money printing and all the rest of it because that's what follows in its train.
Yeah, I remember watching, when I was watching some senators on the Sunday morning talk shows, and they were saying, don't vote for the Republicans because if you vote for them, we'll go back to the failed policies of the past. And I wanted to ask him, which policies are those? Which policies that we don't currently have are we going to go back to?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The whole Obama agenda has been it's just been Bush on steroids, as you've said. And it's like there is no sane party. There's the stupid party and the evil party. Where's the sane party? And then incidentally, we had Jon Stewart with his rally for sanity that he had in Washington, D.C. Did you hear that a reporter went around asking people, is Obama a Keynesian? And people were answering, how dare you call him a Keynesian? He was born in America. What are you, a birther? This is how ignorant these people are.
Well, absolutely. But he's probably more than a Keynesian. He's a socialist. It's beyond just simple Keynes.
Yeah. Well, at this point, it's just a matter of you just have to wince every single morning when you open up the newspaper. Just absolutely horrendous.
Yeah, the thing that I think you really do a good job of explaining, I'd like to hear you talk about it, because everybody is always saying that we had to do something. We couldn't do nothing, that we couldn't let the market fix the problems that the government created, that if we did that, we were going to have a repeat of the Great Depression. And you do a really good explanation of the Great Depression of 1921 that no one's heard of, because the government did exactly that, nothing.
Oh, yeah. This is one of these things that no one talks about, especially when we're told we have to learn the lessons of history. The lessons of history are always print a lot of money and go into debt. That's the lesson of history. So we're not supposed to know anything about this episode where you had a situation where production was down double digits in 1 year, unemployment shot up to double digits very quickly, and you would think there would be calls for public works spending to get people hired. In fact, as Secretary of Commerce, that's exactly what Herbert Hoover was demanding. Was we need more hiring. We need the government to hire people and build bridges and so on and on. But he was, thank heavens, not listened to.
Well, how high did unemployment get in that?
It got to 12.4%.
12.4%. And how much did GDP contract?
By about 17%.
So 17% in what, 1 year?
In about 1 year, and wholesale prices were down 56%. You could imagine Ben Bernanke would be in the hospital at this point.
All right, so that's real deflation. We're afraid of deflation, and prices are still rising.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
prices are going up 2%. We're panicked, right?
So this was a complete collapse in 1 year. The GDP collapsed, unemployment shot up, prices collapsed, and the government did what?
Well, they basically cut the federal budget about in half between 1920 and 22.
So they cut spending? They didn't stimulate? Spending. They did the opposite?
Cut spending. They didn't just slow the rate of growth, any of this nonsense stuff. They actually cut the spending. And then the Fed, if you actually look at the Fed's record at this time, which you can see if you go to the St. Louis Fed website, you can generate it for yourself, the Fed doesn't actually turn the money supply around until after around 1922, when the Depression was already over.
So the Fed was tightening?
The Fed tightened, then the discount rate was slightly lowered, but I mean, this is also because inflation expectations have fallen, so all rates are going to be falling by that point. But by and large, the Fed was passive. It still hadn't really gotten to the point where it was engaged in open market operations as a matter of monetary policy until about 1920.
So in other words, we started out with a bigger economic shock, a bigger collapse than the one we have now. We had no stimulus, no bailouts, no QE2. In fact, the government and the Fed did the exact opposite of what they're doing now, and we got out of it in how long?
About 18 months.
And then we had the Roaring '20s.
Yeah, then we had the Roaring '20s because the tax cuts that we got all through the '20s, those were phased in again largely after the recovery had already occurred. So it wasn't even the tax cuts by and large. It was just letting the market, letting entrepreneurs figure out where resources belong. When people say, "Oh, you guys are just saying that we should sit back and do nothing," no, we shouldn't sit back and do nothing. They should. We entrepreneurs need to get out there and, using the price system, figure out where resources belong and what things need to be liquidated and what things need to be expanded. Only entrepreneurs can do that, and government has no non-arbitrary way of making those decisions.
That's exactly the point. It's not, when the government decides where things go, it has no price signals. It has no way to know what to do, and there's no breaks if they're doing the wrong thing. It's central government planning, and it doesn't work. When things get bad and Bush says we have to abandon capitalism in order to save it, when things are bad, that's when you need capitalism the most.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's the same thing with free speech and all the rest of it. Yeah, I'm all for free speech when everything's perfectly normal and there's no emergency. Well, that's when you need free speech, is precisely in these emergencies. But, imagine if the situation had been reversed. Imagine if we got the Great Depression during the 30s at a time when there was no government intervention, or right now, imagine that we're in a situation where they hadn't done the bailouts and the economy was still sinking. Well, we'd be told that just goes to show that the free market can't solve it. But when in fact the opposite occurs, the government intervenes consistently through the 30s, and unemployment is still in double digits, and the government engages in all these unprecedented interventions in recent years, that's never used, that's never cited as evidence that the government can't do this. That's just evidence.
Well, here's the problem. The fact is, here's how stupid their logic is. We had a depression. We eventually got out of it. It was the longest one we ever had. And during that depression, we tried all kinds of stupid Keynesian things. And the fact that we got out of it, ergo, it must have been all the Keynesian things we did that got us out of it, even though it took forever. And you can argue that, we might have got out of it a lot quicker if it wasn't for all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then the whole World War II thing. During World War II, Alvin Hansen, who was the most prominent American Keynesian there was, Hansen was warning that after the war, if we just cut all this wartime spending, then we cut the federal budget 2/3, we're going to go back into a depression. In fact, he even said, "Look, when the war is over, we can't just stop building ships. We can't stop building ships for a war that's over." But yet, that's exactly what we did. Exactly what we did, and we got the single most prosperous year, 1946, in all of U.S. history. I mean, that's the best.
Well, I know. Well, that's the exact analogy
has ever had, and it failed completely.
That's the analogy I use when I try to describe how much better the Chinese economy would be if they stopped exporting stuff to us.
Yeah,
because exporting to us is the equivalent of making battleships. They're using their resources to produce goods that they don't get to consume. And they're afraid, but if we don't sell these goods to Americans, everyone's going to be unemployed. No, they'll be employed making stuff that they need and that they can enjoy. They'll be better off for it.
And yet this war thing, just the other day, the Washington Post, David Broder had a column, I assume you saw, about, really what we probably need right now to kickstart things is a good war. That would get things going.
Well, no, I wrote a very tongue-in-cheek piece. I don't know if you read it, where I said, how can we have the good parts of the war without the casualties? And then my piece was about we have a pretend war, a fake war. We spend all this money making paint bombs and stink bombs, and we just reenact a civil war. We maybe have a war with Russia, the Soviet Union. We have a world war. We spend all this money with pyrotechnics. We put it on cable TV, and we can waste all the money we want employing everybody fighting a pretend war. And I said, then we can get all the benefits of a war without anybody dying.
Yeah, that in my book Meltdown, I propose that the U.S. and Japan ought to build the most fantastic naval fleets ever known to man. I mean, just unbelievably sophisticated, and then sail them out into the Pacific, and then evacuate all the people so we have no casualties, and then sink them to the ground, and then we'll have a big party celebrating how much richer we are now that we did that.
Well, that's exactly what everybody does. When the Chinese and the Japanese sell us merchandise in exchange for pieces of paper, they might as well take their cargo ships into the middle of the Pacific, dump all the cargo into the ocean, and then head back, because that's basically what they're doing. Anyway, don't go away. Let's stay tuned. After the break, I want to discuss nullification. Welcome back, everybody. If my intelligence keeps growing, I will catch up with my guest, Thomas Wood, who is a very prolific writer. I'm reading now, in addition to the book Nullification that just came out, you got a new book already coming out in early 2011, Rollback, the Battle Plan Against Big Government. How do you write all these books, Tom?
Well, when you have no social life, it becomes really easy to get a lot of things.
But don't you have a big family? You got a lot of kids?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I always, that's the one non-negotiable part of my day. I don't want them to grow up with an absent father, but once they're in bed, especially the last few weeks before a book deadline, it's just complete insanity around here.
So tell me about nullification.
Well, I wrote this basically because I take real pleasure in sticking it to the commissars of approved opinion who exist in our society. And I've come to the conclusion, I think that a lot of people have reached, that maybe the solution to our problems is not going to come from the federal government, and that the idea that the federal government will just limit its own powers just of its own volition is just wishful thinking. And so that maybe we need to think another way, that if the federal government is going to be limited, something other than itself will have to do the limiting. So what I'm trying to do is direct people's attention to this completely forgotten idea from Thomas Jefferson over 200 years ago, which was precisely this. The federal government is not going to limit itself, so the natural candidate to do the limiting would be the state governments, because the states created the federal government. They have to be the watchdogs over it, because otherwise, if you say that the federal government can have a monopoly on determining what its own powers are, I mean, this is like letting a fourth-grade kid grade his own test.
Yeah, I always thought if I ran for governor, that would be my platform. I would say, look, the federal judiciary has let us down. They're not enforcing the Constitution. The federal government has overstepped its bounds. It's operating outside the Constitution. And I would try to enforce the Constitution from the state with the state police, and not enforce unconstitutional laws in my state, and then see what happens. It'd be the equivalent of potential civil war. I guess I don't know if the federal government would send the army into Connecticut, to force me to comply with these unconstitutional laws.
Well, my thinking is that there's strength in numbers, and if you get a bunch of states together saying, well, we're not going to do policy X, and another bunch isn't going to do policy Y, another bunch isn't going to do policy Z. I mean, they're not going to send the tanks into all these places. They're not going to cut off the highway money to all these places. But at least it would be something different. I mean, as I said, 2 years from now, there are going to be a lot of people scratching their heads saying, geez, why didn't the Republicans do anything when they got into Congress? Because that's what they do for a living, is nothing at all. I mean, that is the job description for...
Yeah,
for,
well, I said we have a few, neophytes now, non-politicians, first-timers in Congress, and we'll see if they can resist the corruption, the temptations of power. Once they get into Washington and they get all these guys surrounding them, and they know what to do. They've gone through this drill before. They know how to corrupt the Mr. Smiths who show up in Washington every once in a while with all the perks of power. And it's very intoxicating. And a lot of times what happens to some of these guys, and here's how they convince them. They say, yes, I know how idealistic you are and all this, but if you actually do this, you won't get reelected, and then you'll be replaced by somebody way worse. So what you have to do is compromise all your principles to prevent somebody even worse from taking your place.
Right, which is why I think in many cases I think we have neglected local races and local government. I mean, if you had people with real backbone in the state legislatures and in the governor's mansions, then things could actually get interesting.
Yeah.
And that's what I've hoped to bring back. Of course, poor Martha Dean got pummeled by idiots who know about as much American history as somebody who...
every single candidate I voted for lost, including Martha Dean. And what I will think about nullification, I think what would also help is jury nullification. If we can get some juries to just vote not guilty when people are accused of breaking federal laws, just that we know are unconstitutional, just vote not guilty.
Yeah, exactly. If your peers on a jury will hold you innocent, there isn't anybody who can get you. So absolutely, state nullification, jury nullification. What else can you do against this regime? I mean, just forget about all the conventional approaches. They've all been failures. We might as well try something different.
See, what I'm really worried about is what are they going to turn to when the paper money they're printing has no value? I am already worried about seizing assets and confiscating assets. Starting next year, they passed a law. I don't know if you know about this, but anybody who owns foreign stocks, even if you own